Alan, thank you. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Wendy.
I can't tell you what it's like to be in the same room as Alan Kay. He's my hero. I I was going to make the point that we have 3 Turing awardees in the room. Alan's just leaving. We have Tim and we have Vint. Turing Award given by the ACM is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Computing, and I think it's actually worth more money, isn't it? It's $1 million. Yeah, so it's a very, you can look in Wikipedia, the list of winners, but we had 3 of them here, and Alan Kay, as I say, was one of my heroes. When I was a young lecturer, I can think of him as the father of modern computing. The father of personal computers, anyway. The Dynabook was Alan's invention. So anyone who uses an iPad, that's the man who invented it. So it's my pleasure. Each of the panels has a completely different sort of feel about it. I would say we're the youngsters. That's no. Did I say that? We're going to look more to the future and think about how the internet has impacted on society. And just a couple of opening comments from me, and then I'll introduce the panel. We're now, as many have alluded to, and the last panel as well with Jim, handing neatly to Nigel, who's the first person I'm going to speak on this panel. We're in the era of data, big data, and AI, and it's no coincidence, and people tend to forget this all the time, that the big players in generative AI are the internet companies. That is no coincidence. They have, for 2 reasons. One, we have a devil's pact with them. They have a lot of our data and we just hand it over. They can do what they like with it. And secondly, companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta have developed the engineering ability to trawl the internet, the entire internet, every day, I don't know how many seconds or minutes or hours. And that is an amazing engineering feat. Back in 2000, when Google said they were going to do this, nobody believed them. Nobody believed that was possible, let alone that young search engine that we all moved on to using in 2000 would become one of the biggest companies in the world and help the other companies like Microsoft, help Amazon grow and all the others that have grown because of the internet, but also enable companies like Microsoft to completely change their business model and become internet companies. And there are many other examples of things, but they are the drivers of this future. And anyone who thinks the AI and the internet are not connected, are not related, it's just madness. The internet is the driver of AI and generative AI, any AI that's using big data. And AI is keeping those companies going, if you like. It is the next. So they are inextricably linked. And I think we have to be very wary as we look forward to the era of AI, that we learn the lessons from history. And history tells us we did not seek to govern the internet. Both the panels have talked about that in terms, we have the standards. I mean, we still have the standards that Vint and Bob TCP/IP developed in 1974, but we do not have global governance of the internet. We do not have a level. Where's the gentleman from Kenya? We do not have a level playing field for the global south. So many things that we didn't get right for the internet. We didn't see some of the bad things coming, and people here might talk about that. I don't know. So we have a lot of challenges going forward, and I think we can learn from the history of how the internet has developed as we move forward into what's going to be very much an AI-driven era of the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. I think Les Carr, as our resident comedian, has already invited people to the 100th anniversary of the Internet Party. I saw it going around on Twitter, I think. Okay, so my panel, let's go one by one. Well, Yeah, we'll go around one by one. We've got an order in which we agreed an order in which we're going to do this. And so it's my pleasure, of course, to introduce my good friend and colleague from 2000. You came to Southampton. Little did you know, well, he's a philosopher and psychologist, right? I'm a mathematician and a computer scientist. He does things with computers I wouldn't begin to know how to do. Was a changing part of your life, I think, Nigel. And now, of course, you're at Oxford being principal of Jesus College. Is it principal? Yeah, I always forget which principal was, but principal of Jesus College, and his wonderful wine cellar there. So, Nigel, we agreed that you would go first and give us your view on, the internet and society and how we might go forward in the future. What's going to happen?
Thanks very much, Wendy. Well, I think I'll start with some reflections back just briefly. We're going to give about 5 minutes pitch, that's the idea.
And then we'll do a bit more.
So people have been dating themselves with respect to various significant events, not young at all. Born in the year of the Dartmouth Conference, 1956, which is interesting. And AI had been around before that, of course. Alan Turing's term of choice was machine intelligence, but AI has been around a good amount of time. When I went up to Edinburgh after my philosophy psychology degree, I went up to the Department of AI in Edinburgh in 1978. In fact, the joy of joys was working on BDP and DEC machines connecting through to the ARPANET via the satellite link via UCL and thinking, this is smart, this is neat. I couldn't believe what the possibilities were, but actually, AI got the web, may have used the internet, but got the web very late. And there's a really interesting reason for this, I think we might reflect on. And one of the reasons that a lot of AI's early efforts was around symbolic AI was it didn't have the we had compute power, as we thought was pretty impressive for the time, but we didn't have enough data or compute really seriously to drive the machine learning that has come to dominate. I mean, collecting data was a huge hassle back in the day, whether you worked in computational linguistics or in vision, just assembling data was a huge issue. When we got the web, when we began to weave the web and pull all of this data together, the network effect of data at scale is what has changed everything. Plus, as you say, the compute effect. And the other important thing to remind people of is that Google would not be the thing it is today without the public good that was an open web where they could harvest all of those links, those hyperlinks, and run a PageRank and give us great results back, build a massively successful business model off the back of that. I want to come back to the issue of public goods and public commons as against private goods, because I think that tensioning is where the tipping point where a new rebalancing needs to happen, and perhaps we can believe some of that as an opportunity going forward. So when Jim and I, we had been members of the symbolic AI brigade for many years before the semantic web was a thing, and when I met Tim, when we began to see this opportunity of web at scale, the open data initiatives were really this notion of if we could connect data at scale, I say data, it was data laden with semantics, you hoped, otherwise you would run into all the problems we heard about later on, so you're at the information level. If you could link this stuff together, what could we release? 15 years ago when we began that work, I think we had extraordinary ambitions. I think much of that is work in progress. I think to revisit that is super important because data is going to become the area which is both most contested and there's most opportunity. Why do I say that? Well, when we were doing the open data work, lots of data to get out there, lots of people arguing about what could and couldn't be released. It was non-personal data. We stayed away from challenges around personal data, but that balance is changing too. And we've heard a lot about this trade-off between private for who, private when, under what conditions, in a pandemic, well maybe not. So there's all sorts of renegotiations about what we mean by private for a group, an individual, a collective, or a nation state. There's all sorts of interesting questions that we're still struggling to work out what is a settled position in terms of various stakeholder rights and interests. And when we began Web Science, we were partly enthused by that because the questions we wanted to ask at scale, and in a certain sense, Finn had it exactly right. We're all kind of footnotes to Vint in some sense because he had it exactly right. It's computational X for all X. computational sociology, when we started web science, we imagined it is a total thing now. I mean, the fact that people can answer really important questions about our interactions, about our likes and dislikes of this web of interaction, personal data, has been a crucial feature. However, at the very moment of opportunity, we used to get the Twitter feed, the Spiggeter feed, which we could analyze as researchers. We found a new act of enclosure. So when I talk about public commons, I take us back to the property land commons that was talked about earlier on. Such an interesting analogy to think about. You appropriate content, get your arms around it, and new value is created. But there's huge value in keeping large amounts of our data estate open. Large amounts of it available for researchers for research. The collapse of general agreements about how we can extract and use data collected at scale between university researchers and the platforms is another interesting tension. I've probably taken about 3.5 minutes. Or
no, you're fine.
Am I? Okay, well, I'm rattling on because I want to move to the future and opportunities. The opportunity, well, there's a danger. The danger is that not only that the data becomes appropriated and we have to rebalance those distributions of who has access to it. Why, for example, the solid protocols, the idea of re-decentralizing the web is a powerful countervailing set of ideas. We all think the deal is done. In some sense, the platforms have and appropriate all the data. These things are never done. It's always a work in progress. It's always retensioning. The real issue for us now is in a world in which our large language models demand pretty well twice as much data as their parameter size, a couple of trillion tokens. We've consumed most of the human-generated content, so we're now relying on machine-generated content. We have reasons to believe that the pre- and post-generative AI era will mark a kind of pollution event, or some people see it as an opportunity, where machine-generated content has some quite undesirable qualities. And the issue of a possible model collapse and a issue around data provenance and quality is a new emerging threat in the landscape. Not talked about a lot, but I think has to assume a much higher. So the issues, again, talked earlier, Vin talked about provenance. Where was this content generated, under what conditions, what model? Has it been reused in our training? We're already seeing artifacts from our generative AIs that appear to have been the result of AIs being trained on other AI output. And the final, let's talk about some upside. The upside on this has got to be that we're an ingenious species. We run a slow hindbrain that gets in the way very often, not quite fast in some contexts. Stone Age in some respects, as Alan pointed out, but we're incredibly ingenious about necessity being the mother of invention. Science gives us one way to sort the good from the bad and the indifferent. My hope here is that the new kinds of web science we can do, the new kinds of internet science, are all about the entanglement of ourselves with our algorithms and our data at scale. We barely begin to scratch the surface on what those emergent properties look like. They hold promise for science, they hold promise for ill and good, they hold promise for ingenious researchers in compute-starved labs like Oxford's, with all these bright people, to think, do I need all this compute? Do I need all this data? Can I sparsify it? Does it need this much energy? There is a ton of innovation to happen in spaces where resources are differently distributed. We will see it in the global south, just back from South Africa, where I saw people in Kayamandi and informal settlements, free access to broadband, very cheap data, much of it being driven from solar, much of it using completely different mesh networks. An idea of innovation in that space is also exciting. So there's much to talk about, much to kind of express, but I just think that we should never lose sight of the fact that the network effects of what we build are hugely powerful if we don't appropriate them, that we reflect on the fact we have to build a public commons as well as a private good.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Ivy. just reflecting on all that and your, background in psychology and philosophy, the relationship people have with, say, Web 2.0, social media, and the relationship they might have with this, let's call it ChatGPT for now. That's too trivial, but it's the future the generative AI and other AIs. How is that? My worry is that people will think it's just another type of social media. Does that?
Well, part of the trouble is they might think it's another kind of actual agentic intelligence. I mean, it is a kind of agentic intelligence. It's just we remember when we had those projects on Memories for Life, imagining posthumous representations of the late departed 15 years ago, whatever. These realities mean that we will change our sensibilities around what our interactions are and whether we're having extended conversational interactions with artificial or human agents will be, well, it's consequential, but it's happening right now. It will happen in education, in health, in all sorts of different contexts. It's already happening massively in commerce. We ask ourselves, what's important to understand about the nuance? What's important to understand about the fact that the agent on the other side has not had a lived experience, contrary to some views, is not having first-person experiential kind of interest in the way that you and I are having. So it's accommodating to those realities, which are still quite poorly understood, I would suggest, in terms of their sociology.
And also, people got to ChatGPT through the web.
Yes.
I mean, so to me, it's for people who don't understand the technology, it must be incredibly confusing about what it is and isn't. Perhaps we can pick that up a bit later. I'm now going to turn to my far right to our friend Noshir Contractor, who because his oh God, his uncle's Farouk Engineer. I love I always have to say this because it's the cricket connection. I love the names, and Noshir's someone who's moved from being an electrical engineer to a social scientist. Now that is no mean feat in itself, and someone who's accepted as a social scientist.
Yes, I think so.
And when we
Last time I checked.
well, it's hard for electronic engineers to get that acceptance, actually, because I know what social scientists are like. Where's Pauline in the room somewhere? They're not that easily accepting of engineers. You made the mistake, of course, of when we ran the first Web Science Conference in Athens. Did you know that was in Athens? Yeah. But it was rather weird because there was a parallel conference going on in Greek. I'll tell you that story over wine tonight. It was rather weird, wasn't it? There was this parallel conference in Greek about Greek culture in parallel with the Web Science Conference. Nigel was a keynote, Tim was there, and we invited you to be a keynote. And we've never let you go since. Because he's absolutely brilliant in this world, and he's going to talk about it. But I would like to also say that he's just agreed to take over from me as the Executive Director of the Web Science Trust. So thank you, Nosh. The Web Science Trust is in good hands.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. It remains to be seen whether I'm able to fulfill into those footsteps. I'm going to try my best in that respect, nonetheless. But I'm really excited, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel on the Internet and Society. I flew in this morning from Florence, where I spent the last 4 weeks teaching a class, a study abroad program for Northwestern University in Florence on the Renaissance and the Renaissance networks in particular. And the fact that I've spent that much time thinking about that has really positioned me to think about what we're doing today in this particular context. Because in a sense, if you look at the parallels between what happened during the Renaissance in the 14th and the 15th century in Florence, there are some amazing parallels. There was a time where there had people who had big patrons, not the kinds of patrons that Vint talked about in terms of government or DARPA, but they had their own set of patrons, and they were making very important contributions and changes in looking at art and science and politics. They revolutionized communication. The printing press happened as part of the Renaissance period. They radically changed the notion of what we think of today as commerce. The guilds came about during that period. Entertainment, art, education, a lot of those things happened during the Renaissance period. And today we are seeing again a parallel of that happening in the context of the internet, of the web, and of AI more generally. And I think that these contributions are making huge differences when it comes to expression, creativity, art. Also have in common a sense of interdisciplinarity, of collaboration across a lot of different constituents in society that are coming together to make this happen, which is again is parallel with what was going on then, and the global influence and the spread. Now, it took a little longer at the time to have the global influence and spread, but it was there then, and it's happening at exponential forms today. So what is it then that we can learn from all that we have seen happen during these spurts of incredible growth of revolution that we've seen in the past? And there is a lot to be learned from that. And I'm going to spend some of my time looking into the future by learning from the past in these different contexts. So if you think about the fact that we had the internet come in, and the internet brought a lot of computers together. I'm old enough to have spent time on the old Milnet and ARPANET networks. I was even banned from the internet when I was a graduate student at the University of Southern California because somebody mistook my last name, contractor, to mean that I was a defense contractor that was trying to crack into a system. And so I've had that experience of having to have the odd experience of jumping on the internet. At the time, it was email, it was SMTP that was coming into place. And we were studying what was the effect of that on society, on the changing nature of work at the time. I love the phrase new media because it's eternal. Every time, every generation thinks of what it does as the new media. At the time, it was the email system that we were looking at. That gave way, and as we began to look at it, that gave way to things like the ERP, the enterprise resource planning, customer relations management. Someone says that this field is ripe with jargon monoxide. And that's what we see in all of these different acronyms that we've come up with. The social machines was a big invention that came along with the web. And I like the notion of weaving the web because it told us how important that network was and how powerful that metaphor that we always had in society that we heard about in the last panel has been reinforced, amplified, reimagined on a continuing basis. And it's on the substrate of that internet and the web that we now talk about the Gen AI. And it is when people say that the Gen AI is, and GPT has been rechristened in some context as standing for general purpose technology and equated to the steam engine, I think it's important to recognize that this is really the ensemble of the internet, the web, and on top of that, the Gen AI, which makes it this new steam engine or the general purpose technology, which is why web science has to constantly be nimble and reimagine itself as not just studying the original web as it was first thought about, not just Web 2.0 or Web 3.0, but now all of these new infrastructures that are being built on top of the web and that are now allowing us to think about a society where humans and AI are inextricably linked. It gives new meaning to Vince's notion of the Turing test too, where the power of the computer to tell whether a human being, whether the computer could distinguish between a human being and another computer, and that is important as we look at this part. As last thing I'll just say in closing, three steps to keep in mind as we look at all these, as we look at the future. Every technology that we have seen, going back to the printing press, the telephone, and right up to now into Gen AI, we think of the technology in the short term and we overestimate its impact in the short term and we underestimate its impact in the long term. I'm not the person who coined it. This is Amara's law. But the idea is because in the short term we think it's a substitute for what we do. That's not where we get the real payoffs. That's not where we get either the positive or the negative outcomes that come from it. We next move from substitution to say, oh, but we can do a lot more of it because it's so easy to do it. Think about the amount of time we spend using GPT to write the same letter that we might have written in the first place. We do a lot more letter writing because it's so easy to do it. The real benefits of every single technology historically, and I suspect it's going to continue as we look at the internet and society today, is the reconfiguration. How do we reimagine what we do, whether it's the changing nature of work, whether it's education, whether it's any of these different creative expression? How do we reconfigure it to truly take advantage? Robert Solow, who was an economist and won the Nobel Prize, said, when we look at IT, we find its effects everywhere except in terms of productivity. And the same thing applies both in the context of productivity, but also in terms of societal impacts. We need to think hard about how we can leverage it. The first iron bridge that was ever invented in the world was right here in the UK. The interesting thing is that when they tried to construct that bridge, they had no sense of how to create an iron bridge. They used the technology of wood dovetail sockets to create that bridge. That's what we are doing today. We are constantly using the internet as a way of saying that we take the Pony Express to take a message to the next place. And that's what we need to think about. Not substitution, not enlargement, but reconfiguration of technology.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you the same sort of question I asked Nigel. You mentioned the Turing test, which I used to teach about that, in the early days, and it was really, could a human being tell the difference between a human being?
This was the second version of it.
Yes, I get that,
Yeah.
and so you said, can a computer tell? Well, actually, I always thought the problem with the original Turing test was that Turing overestimated the intelligence of human beings. Because actually, it's incredibly easy to fool a lot of human beings. Machines can quite easily do that. Now, but that's just my sort of way of looking at the world. But you're a team, your work is about teams.
Yeah.
Now, in the future, powered by the internet, multi-agent systems, we will have, AIs will be, whatever they are, will be part of the teams.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about looking at, today's Zoom calls.
Yeah.
I assume all those people, all those pictures up there are human beings. In the future, they won't all be.
No.
I mean, what's your view?
I think this is exactly one of the areas in which we need to reimagine, not think of the AI today as a crouch, as something that is a crutch, but rather as a coach. And we still think about it in that way, and how it's going to take it's going to have massive impacts in terms of teams at the individual level, at the organizational level. You may be right, Wendy, that AI technologies is consolidated by the internet companies, but the technologies they are developing are disrupting the rest of the industries quite
absolutely.
dramatically.
Yes,
and that's not to lose sight of what's happening on that particular front. One of the ways in which we've been thinking about that is we think of technology initially as something that was a tool that we used. Then we moved and thought about it as an assistant. Think of Siri, Alexa, and so on, Google Assistant. But then we began to think about it as a teammate. In many cases, it is today not only a teammate, but in some cases a manager. There's good work being done at Stanford where the technology and the AI is allocating who is doing what work and at what point you are on the fly creating a virtual organization that comes together, governed by the AI, to be able to think about how to work in this context. So the notion of how we reimagine not just having a human in the loop, but a computer in the group, as was some people talk about.
I like that. Yeah.
That have really made this a very important part of what we are doing.
A group of computers and a group of
A group of computers. Well, there was one last comment I'd make since you brought that up. There was Warren Bennis, who's now, the late Warren Bennis, was a very famous pundit, management pundit at USC, and he said that the future of the factory will be one man and one dog. And the responsibility of the man would be to watch the dog, and the responsibility of the dog would be to make sure the man didn't mess with all the robots who were actually running the factory.
Okay, on that note, shall we turn to Vicky Nash? Vicky is you're the director of the Oxford Internet Institute now, aren't you? Yeah. When I first met Vicky, what were you then, a research fellow? Yes. Because when we started Web Science at Southampton, before we started the Web Science Trust, it was called WSRI, I think, in the early days, wasn't it? We were just us and MIT, and the first partners we had were the Oxford Internet Institute, and we had that EPSRC grant to do all sorts of exciting things. And you were the person at the Oxford Institute. I think of you as the person who ran it. I mean, Bill Dutton was the director, but
we had a fantastic summer school, didn't we, with brilliant students from over the world.
Yeah, absolutely, and we did some really cool stuff under that. Yeah, so it's fabulous to have you here now as the boss of the Institute. Congratulations. Off you go, Vicky.
Thank you so much. It is.
Oh, you're a political scientist, I meant to say. That's her background. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and philosopher actually as
Okay,
well, like
all right.
Nigel, political theorist, political philosopher, political scientist. Thank you so much for the invitation today. So, as you said, I have got this incredibly privileged position at the moment of being director of the Oxford Internet Institute, which means that on a daily basis I work with about 200 graduate students, about 50 faculty members, all of whom focus on the internet and society, trying to understand, why does it matter? What's happened over the last 50 years or so. So this topic, really, really close to our hearts. I wanted to go back, though, to a very basic point that Vint made at the beginning. So when he introduced this idea of the internet as a sort of this network of networks, for me, the key point is that behind many of those machines that are being connected, there are human beings. Not all of them, to be fair, but many of them. And I suppose it's that I wanted to focus on in my sort of 4 or 5 minutes. So, for me, we might have 50 years of the technology, but if I look at, say, ChatGPT today, right now, it looks as if we discovered AI in the last year. And so I wanted to cast our minds back a little bit to see what did it look like when we discovered the internet, and how has that changed the way that we communicate, and maybe how has it given rise to some of these concerns that lots of people have mentioned today. So, disinformation, electoral manipulation, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you can sort of cast your mind back, and I recognize there are some people who are so young in the room, they won't remember some of this, but never mind. If we think back to sort of the 1990s, it was very much about work. It was about email, it was about research. Obviously, we did have interest groups, bulletin boards, news groups, and so on. Largely text-based, maybe some imagery if you had a decent internet connection. But it's so different to what we have now. Advance it a little bit, early 2000s. You start to get maybe sort of slightly more decent broadband. I seem to remember one of the first events we ever held at the OII in 2001 was what would we do if we had 1 megabyte per second as a society, right? So that's what we were dealing with. Think about the advent of social media. So move from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. What was key about that? Well, again, if you can remember back, before then, you could consume things, maybe if maybe you could post to a specialist site, but you certainly couldn't share, you couldn't create on the scale that we do now. You couldn't reach an audience of thousands, even millions, with a message that you write on your computer at home. Think about the move from the PC to mobile technology, right? So the predominant message about internet safety in the early 2000s was you had a family PC and you put it in a lounge and you looked over the shoulder of your children while they were using it. Move to mobile, you have a private device in your pocket, in your child's pocket, that can be used wherever, whenever, and nobody, need know what you're doing with it. Think ahead perhaps a little bit further, and we have, with the advent of mobile, we have app-based interfaces, which enable, the rise of not just more and more children as users, but the idea almost of sort of the pre-literate internet user. So you've had all these changes in technology, in the device, in the platform, in the interface, etc. All of them phenomenal, but these have very rapidly changed the way we use the internet to communicate with each other. So if I look at that, and I love that, and I think about all the amazing things that's enabled us to do, all the changes in education, in our ability to access information, in the way we talk to each other, how we communicate with other people on the other side of the world, that is all incredible. But clearly at the same time, it is those very same characteristics or affordances that give rise to things like fake news, disinformation, about political propaganda, the role of external actors, hate speech, bullying, child sexual abuse materials being shared, and so on. So that's how we've got to where we get to today. That many of the things that are great about the internet are also the things that underpin what's bad about it. Now, one of the lessons I think that we've been discussing a lot in this panel is what can we learn from looking back and take to improve things in the future. So for me, just a couple of points. So the first thing, and I'm so glad I can say this year, I think we're getting better at regulation in this space. I don't think we're there, and I think it's going to take a few iterations, but the idea that this is somehow, unregulable, as many people thought in the early 2000s, I think is very much proven not to be the case. So, yes, it is right that if you're going to make millions, billions out of these technologies, you need to develop them responsibly, and you probably need to sell products that are broadly safe, at least, for users. Second, though, we also need to understand a bit more about the effects of these technologies. So to go back to York, a great point you're making about data. At this point where we're worrying about the problem of disinformation, we actually don't know if it makes a difference. It's very hard for us to demonstrate that it actually will switch an election or change somebody's mind. We talk about data provenance. Once you've seen the image, it doesn't necessarily matter where it's come from. If it's had an emotional effect, go back to Alan's point about different parts of your brain, the damage is done, right? So we need more research, and in order to do that research, we often need access to data only held by these large companies. So Data Commons, completely agree with. My last point, I guess, in closing, would be that I think, we're getting much better about talking about how we design these technologies to be more responsible, to be more human, more people-centered. But actually, as the flip side of that, we also need to think about the role of these technologies in our lives and prepared to think about the sort of messy human realities which shape our interaction with them, right? So why do we have the rise of incel movements online? Why are so many of our young men feeling disenfranchised and involved with no future? That's not down to the internet. That's going to be something much deeper. So for me, that's the last message. The internet is here to stay. We can think about the technology problems, but you also think much, much more deeply about how technology and society interact with these long-held social problems. Thank you.
So you've developed one of the best MSCs around in this area. I forget exactly the name.
We have two: social science, the internet, and social data science. Which one do you want?
The social science, the internet.
Yeah.
What do you at the end of that MSc? What are you expecting your students to understand, know about, and go out and do?
We expect them to understand a bit about how it works, about how it is and why it's difficult to regulate. And then thirdly, we expect them to understand how you study its implications in society. So what questions can you ask, with what data, and why is that useful?
So important. We've been trying to do this at Southampton for donkey's years. We need more of these types of interdisciplinary courses. So if you're at a university, think about this, and we need it for internet and AI to get across. Thank you, Vicky. So last but by no means least, Professor Hannes Werthner. Now, you say you're retired, but I don't think of you as a retired person at all, from Vienna University of Technology. And you're most well known, and we're working with you on the work you do on digital humanism. And you had the workshop in 2019. I assume you didn't have one in 2020 because of COVID, the pandemic, but you had the Vienna Manifesto then. And you're a key figure behind the Digital Humanism Initiative. You've got the book. You're a computer scientist. And we gave you the last word because I think you're going to be a bit, I was going to say controversial, maybe. Anyway, we'll leave it to Hannes to decide what he wants to say at the end of this panel.
First of all, thanks for the invitation to participate at this meeting. From a personal note, when I started to study computer science 50 years ago, I had problems to explain my friends and my family what I would study at that moment. They did not understand. At that moment, we had this digital brain or electronic brain, something like a notion for that. And I could not imagine that 50 years later, I would sit here in this room participating in this high-level discussion. What happened in these 50 years is, and it was explained very well, that we have this ensemble of technologies. It's not only the internet, it's coming from the internet up to generative AI, it's mobile device, it's the PC, it's everything is a little technological revolution, but in its total, I think it's functioning as the operating system of our society. I think it's something really you can compare. It's the hardware, it's the software, and it's the people, it's the behavior, it's the means, how we use it. And I think this is very similar to the notion of an operating system. With this, we have arrived, not only technology, but we also as a community, at the center of our society. We have arrived at the governmental levels. It is discussed at international organizations level. It is discussed at individual government levels. The good side and the bad sides. I will also talk about the bad sides a little bit, or let's say the downsides. As a background to digital humanism, I didn't know that, but 56 states of the world, including also international organizations, have rules and principles and regulation how to govern the internet and how to approach AI in some general terms. And this is a very high number. The bad news is that it's mainly about misuse or about some shortcomings we can observe in the AI field. But one thing we did not mention in discussion up to now is the high concentration within the web. We have very few companies. It's the the platform companies, the internet companies, somehow governing, controlling the web. We have a decentralized architecture by design. The web and the internet is a decentralized architecture, and it's funny that on the economic level, we have a highly concentrated web. We have changed somehow from a citizen, it was designed for sharing for citizens, we became consumers. So it was then somehow, let's say, the clicks are important and not, let's say, data sharing. These two sides, let's say the positive sides, the contribution to wealth, to progress, also democratization in some sense, but also the bad sides, the downsides. This is the background of the Digital Humanism Initiative, where we started 2019. So we had a workshop very interdisciplinary, from computer science up to political science, anthropologists, historians, where we also wrote and signed the Vienna Manifesto on digital humanism. And we somehow, not directly rooted, but we have a relationship or a heritage coming from the Vienna Circle for some of these philosophers like Popper, who said there is no reasonable alternative to optimism. So you should look at the future also. If there are some downsides, you should look at the possibilities offered by that. And with that sense, we define digital humanism as something where we look and analyze the interplay or the co-evolution of technology and humans, but we also try to interfere to make it some better for a better society, a sustainable society, where the human needs and values are in the center of the development. We understand, and this is in the tradition of humanism, and it's also going back to your Renaissance example, we are the agents of our life. We have to envision the future. It's up to us. There's nobody else in the room, nobody else in the world who can do that. It's up to us. It's a collective decision. We have to design it jointly. And this is the background of this digital humanism we are doing. We are looking forward to joining forces. I very much like the notion Vint Cerf has mentioned, this digital social contract or social digital contract in all mutations or combinations. It's important. It's digital, it's social, it's about the society, it's about us. And contract, it has to be mandatory. There has to be some obligations we need to follow. I think it's too important to leave it up to some very few companies, or even also only to some governments. I think it's up to us, and this is the notion of digital humanism, where we are active. We are doing books, we are doing summer schools. We have a summer school at the beginning of September where we go, especially at PhD students, in an interdisciplinary manner, where we go from computer science up to history. This is something we are doing now for the third year. And we will have a big digital humanism conference, I can announce now, in spring 25. Together with the city of Vienna, who plans to do a yearly event on digital humanism, understanding that technology is something we have to design, to engineer and envision jointly on an international scale, also involving other sciences. It's too important to leave it up to computer scientists.
Oh, absolutely. Karen Spark-Jones always said it's too important. Computer science is too important to leave to men. Just say.
This is, let's say, male computer science.
That was the late great Karen Spark-Jones's contribution to the debate. Thank you, Hans. Now, in the interest, I could ask you lots of questions, but I would say I had the privilege of going to Vienna when was your last conference?
In June.
Last year, was it not? Gosh,
it was about, it was.
And they're amazing conferences because they're so wonderfully interdisciplinary. And our alliance is the Web Science Trust, the People-Centered Internet, Digital Humanism, People-Centered Internet, Digital Humanism, and the Digital Enlightenment Forum, George. So this is coming now. In the interest of time, we haven't had any questions from Slido for a while. So Bill is going to take the last 20 minutes of this. All right. So he can, all right, panel.
Are we
Questions
good?
from Slido.
So I just say, as a philosopher and a psychologist and a political scientist and a computer scientist, and I love all of you, obviously, but as someone who was taught by Elizabeth Anscombe, I'm dubious about basing anything on the Vienna Circle, so we need to talk about that later. There have been a range of questions about governance, and I think they're relevant here, about the IETF, about ICANN, other things. And one question in particular from Laura Ellis, who's in the audience, struck me as being of interest and maybe something you can all address. Laura says, are there global deliberative democracy models we should be aspiring to as we come to grips with the next 50 years of the internet, as technologies are evolving so quickly? So should we be looking for completely new models of governance, and what might they be?
Who'd like to go first on that one?
I can
Vicky,
say what I
you've been
think.
volunteered.
So, yeah. So I do think that, I do think we can do more at the global level, but I don't think we can do it all at the global level. We either agree on things like standards and protocols, where it's clear in everybody's interests to agree globally. We maybe agree on a very sort of thin sliver of issues where actually our values are broadly aligned. I think we've got much further on issues around things like countering child sexual abuse materials online than I ever thought we'd get. But actually, even when you start talking about things which in theory everybody agrees about, like human rights, it gets quite difficult. So I don't think it's, I wouldn't want to say we shouldn't try. I guess I'm a bit too long in the tooth to say that's going to solve everything.
No?
No,
Nigel?
just on the point that you mentioned that to some extent regulation has there's some causes for optimism around that thought. I mean, we had the online safety bill go through, which I think was a powerful piece of work in the UK. Other stuff possibly going to go through in the context of a new government. What does intrigue me about all of this is how far we can kind of get both a larger and a local discourse here. So I'm quite interested by the notion of in deliberative democracies, notions like citizen juries. People are re-examining what it means to bring people together to come to kind of reasonable views, and whether computing, I mean, again, the original dream of a lot of the internet was this notion of a public square to bring people together, and we've seen have we seen a failure of nerve? Is it just that we don't have the right platforms? It genuinely interests me the extent to which we can take that forward, and whether regulation has a place and a space to play in that is, I think, important. I think we can agree collectively on broad issues, as you say. I'd like to think that in some specific areas we can move forward both collectively and. Just to say, I'm quite optimistic about the notion of regulation. When you listen to those who consume their podcasts, Kara Swisher, Pivot, they're always banging on about the absolutely essential need for capitalism to be left to run its route. Just it's all about maximising shareholder value, and then government should step in and do the regulation. That is very much a view that the West Coast seems to embody. I do think we have to imagine that there could be a more permissive state position where companies themselves can work with governments in less than just a profit-seeking motive. I mean, it's very easy to establish the fact that it's just about shareholder value. There used to be a public purpose behind private companies. They used to have public purposes, and I wonder whether we couldn't reimagine instigating those sorts of institutional changes.
This is a very complicated question, no? Because it's a normative one. It involves an ethical question. You could also follow Kant and things like that. I would like to add a second dimension to that, because it's not only between states or among states and international organizations, because you also have to look, what Nigel has mentioned, you also have to look at private companies. And you have to interfere also with private companies. It cannot be that the main development or also the research at the moment going on in generative AI is mainly done by private companies. University has a serious problem following up, either by resources on different levels and things like that. I think this is an issue we have to reason about, and there are several ideas how this could be done. At the moment, I think an important body for, let's say, agreeing on principles, I think, is United Nations. I think we should focus there because I think it's the only international body where the different parts of the world, where we are in a very fast movement, we are going into a new Cold War. I think the danger is really here. I think United Nations plays an important role, and I think we should really carefully look at technology, what role technology plays here. Universities in control, and let's say technology could even play a bridging function, and they should not be a dividing function in that sense. And also international organization here. I think this we should also see as a task, or let's say a vision we could also have as an academic community to realize this situation and to provide an answer. So it's much more complicated than democracy, yes or no.
I think very briefly, I think the only person on the panel born in the Global South, I want to amplify an issue that you raised, but also bring us back to Mei Lin's point this morning about Singapore and the secret of success there. I think that I agree that organizations like WSIS are places where we could be able to have this, but I think we need to recognize the plurality of opinions and understanding of what deliberative democracies mean in different parts of the world. And that means that whatever technology policy we want to do has to be a very light touch that meets some lowest common denominator in order to have the collective action that Nigel was touching on earlier on, but be able to do it in a way that doesn't alienate major portions of the world.
Thank you.
Do you want to step out of the chair for a moment, Wendy, and give your opinion
What?
on the question? Yeah.
Oh, I've just been immersed in the United Nations stuff for a year, and our report will come out next month. And
Do send us a draft.
well, I can't. I suspect Doreen's seen it. And it goes in through the digital compact. It doesn't go in to the General Assembly. And I'm very comforted to hear, because when I first went onto that board, a lot of people said, "Oh, United Nations, it's flawed. It can't peacekeep. What can it do?" But there is no other body that can do it at this level. And I've enjoyed the process, but I really hope that the major recommendations in the report are adopted by the General Assembly so that we can move forward. It's a long journey. It's not going to be. We can all agree that we need standards. We need good dialogue. We need capacity building for the Global South. But how you actually do that is quite difficult. So
Okay,
anyway,
thank you.
I was sort of hoping
I will move on.
in.
There is plenty of time. I've got two more questions.
Oh.
So I'm going to sort of combine two questions, one from Pete Ray and one from Timotei Freitas. So Timotei asks, how can the public be protected from misinformation or disinformation as a societal evil mediated by technology? Strong words there. And then Pete asks, and it's sort of linked, do we think the increasing use of the internet and social media is negatively affecting the behaviour and mental health of young people? So what do we feel about the downsides or potential downsides of the network? Is there evidence, and is there anything that we could do about it?
I refer you to an excellent report from the Royal Society on the online information environment. I mean, it's actually, it takes the rather interesting view that it's not about taking down misinformation and censoring platforms. It's about a bigger, broader educative process, which actually starts partly with dispelling some myths about what science is. I mean, the idea is that part of the failure in trust is often that people see scientists as people in white coats that come down and hand down the truth. And what you've got to try and the story has got to be about the fact we all stand on the edge of error, and our whole process is about dealing with error correction.
That's not going to get you elected.
Pardon?
That's not going to get you elected. We all stand on the edge of error.
But that is the challenge. And that is the challenge. How do we bring that sense of a critical framing of what it is to make sense of the world? And then actually, the idea of misinformation and conspiracy theories is about bringing some kind of critical thinking skills into that, and to just give up on it. And actually, some of the evidence on the impact of these efforts, the jury appears to be out on that, actually, as a matter of fact.
Vicky,
I completely agree.
and then we'll come to you, Hannah.
So actually one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest problems for me is we don't have good research evidence really on either of these questions for some fairly obvious reasons. So one is media effects research has always been difficult, I think, hasn't it? Actually, not to show that, you know, media content A has had effect B on people is really, really hard because people read the newspaper, they watch TV, they talk to their friends, etc. So isolating that something is happening because you've read some misinformation online is difficult. But it also seems to be the case that where we do have evidence, it is much more complicated, and it's also about the relationship of information across the ecology. So it's the fact that, you know, sometimes this stuff is picked up by broadcast media, or it makes its way onto Fox News in the US, etc. It's picked up by friends. So that's the very first thing. I think in terms of how you protect people, you're right. We need to do more work on the evaluation of what works. But actually, just some basic things like investing much more in critical media literacy in schools, inoculation techniques, etc. There are places we can start. On the mental health one, I mean, again, if people are interested in this, I can point you towards some really good researchers at OII who are, who are looking at it at the macro level, right? So at the macro level, it doesn't look like there are clear negative effects on mental health that one can blame on social media. Doesn't mean that for individuals, there may not be problematic outcomes, but certainly at societal level, the type of message that you're seeing and things like that book by Jonathan Hay does not seem to be borne out. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Hannes and then...
I'll just say very quickly, I'd say notion that in many of these areas, there are dual effects. We see opposite effects happening in spite of each other. And in the case of misinformation, a lot of the focus has been on regulating or finding ways to reduce the supply. I think a lot of the social science research is trying to focus on the fact that the supply might be down, but the demand is still there for it. And so that's the part of the social science making and trying to understand.
And I think you've got to be very careful about evidence, because I was just looking up, Susan Greenfield was pilloried when she was done some neuroscientist at Oxford she said she had evidence our brains were changing, and she was pilloried and bullied out, because she was just making this claim and they said there wasn't the evidence for it. Sorry. So we've got to be very careful about what we say.
Hannes, do you want to add?
No, there are several, just with social media, there are several examples where they show positive effect on engagement, participation, political movements, things like that, especially Africa. I had a student as a fellow coming from South Africa. She was collecting examples of that. So it's a dual side again. So I would not just blame it, but you could also have a look at the positives.
Thank you.
Just as
No, that's helpful. And particularly those interested in misinformation and health information, I refer you to a forthcoming paper from the Royal Society, BBC and the Wikimedia Foundation, which is being written even as we speak and will be published soon. Soon, which is as good as it's going to get. Right, we're now going to go for the traditional light-hearted final any questions type question from Andrea Malucci. Very brief answers here. At university, my professors always ask, if you were to redo your project, what would you do differently? If we were to redo the internet, what would you do differently?
Right, but who wants to start? No, you can't say anything.
Later.
Who wants to go first? You gonna no? Someone first?
He's asking what the question was.
I did not understand.
What would you do differently if we were starting now? You're sitting in the lab with Vint and Bob.
Can we talk about the web or just the internet?
The internet. This is a conference about the 50th anniversary of the internet. I have my own issues with Tim.
All right, we'll save that for the 50th anniversary of the web then. All right, and what would you do differently?
Okay. Come on then, Mylin. You get 30 seconds.
The internet spread through the NRENs, the National Research and Education Networks. What I would do differently is be very careful about sending the ISPs out without the intellectual capital centers of the countries and the communities. And so I think that if the NRENs, the National Research and Education Networks, had spread out to their feeder schools and their schools had spread out to their feeder communities, we would have a much better answer than schools saying, you mean I have to have an IT department?
Okay, that's
Okay,
the time. Thank
right.
you.
And of course, we will ask Vint that question.
No, well, Vint-
But
Vint
but
now-
I want to finish this session and then we'll.
No, Vint now gets to come and close everything down.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that's why he has
Including the
absolute
internet.
opportunity to
He
rebut
started it.
everything you've just said.
Okay.
That's me. Done.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Al.
Thank you.
Stay here a minute. Stay here a minute. I want to thank my panel. We could have gone on forever with this stuff. It's getting very hot and stuffy in here, and we're keeping you from Vince's closing remarks and the alcoholic refreshments that come at 5:30, courtesy of our sponsors. And I wanted to say thank you. As I sit here looking at the audience and all the people that are here that have been so instrumental in developing the internet themselves. I can see some amazing people in this room have been part of that journey from the get-go. And thank you all for coming and being part of this. We have been live streamed today. That recording will go on the Royal Society website and on in the ACM Digital Library, and probably on all our websites as well. So for people to see, they won't be able to interact in the way we've done. This is, and we're going to produce a report of the day jointly with the, of course, Ross. It's probably Royal Society report that we join in on. I just wanted to say that this event has been a year in the planning. The internet's been 50 years. Marlene and I now have an annual summit at the Beach Chalet in San Francisco. It's right on the beach by the Golden Gate Bridge. We've just had, at the one we had last year, we planned this event, because of course they've already had an event at Stanford, much a bigger event than this one, and I think Marlene's planning something in Asia as well, because it's a year of the 50th anniversary of the internet that PCI have been crafting. And so we had our second Beach Chalet Summit, 3 weeks ago? So you have no idea what's coming next, right? We have plotted and planned for some exciting things going forward. So I'm going to say thank you to all the teams, thank you to the panels. We're now going to leave the stage and give Vint the last word. But I would like him to answer the question, what would you have done differently? Thanks, panel.
I'll fail miserably in trying to summarize anything. So instead, I'm going to draw attention to a few things that really caught my eye and I jotted down. So this is a pithy report, so to speak. The first thing I think I would do differently is to bring sociologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and others into the development of the internet to understand its impact on its users. We didn't do that because at the beginning it was being built by a bunch of engineers trying to solve what was a technical problem. We didn't fully appreciate what was going to happen once it became available to the general public and the private sector. Looking back, if we had understood that, I would have drawn on additional resources, socioeconomic expertise in social and economic impact of technology, but we didn't understand that it was going to do that. And I have the feeling that it might have been difficult to do that because people would say, well, this is just an experiment and why would we waste time on this social and economic and psychological analysis, but we should have done that. Probably the most important one word that I'm taking away from this conference is responsibility. And the notion of responsibility -X. Just like computational X, responsible X, I think, should become a really important part of the way we think. We should, whether it's individuals or institutions, organizations, or states, need to learn to take responsible actions with technology. Investors can't get away with the argument, well, I just put money into this company and what it decided to do isn't my fault. Yes, it is. What you decide to invest in and to encourage and support should involve some sense of responsibility. So I think that's an important message from this meeting, is to start talking about responsible X for many different values of X. One thing I can tell you about the leadership panel of the Internet Governance Forum is that we put a paper out called The Internet We Want. And the next version of that is going to be something like The Internet We Want and How to Get There. And that is a really, really important challenge to figure out. Given all of today's discussions, that's exactly what we need. We need a roadmap for figuring out how to get to a better place in the internet than we are at today. Also, it occurred to me as I was looking at all the acronyms that we should build a monument. It's called the Acronympolis. And it would be the temple of acronyms, and we could put that in, of course, somewhere in Athens would be the appropriate place. Mei Lin said something that science should serve humanity, and I think that is exactly right. But I also realize that there's something fascinating about truth and fiction. Even in scientific circles, this is one of the reasons we have so much trouble with science. In scientific circles, we do our very best to come up with the explanations for how things work and why they work that way. And when people ask us to use that expertise, we respond to the best of our ability. Then research continues, and we may discover that the theory we had fallen in love with and was demonstrated by the measurements we made is not right. It's not exact enough. And so when people come and say, what should I do? And we tell them, you should do this based on what I know. 10 years later, they come and they ask the same question. You say, well, you should do Y, which is different than X because we've had 10 years to figure it out. Some people will say, thank you for the additional information. And other people will say, so you lied to me about X. And so I don't believe Y either. And this is a serious problem of people not understanding the mechanics of science. The idea that we are willing to abandon what we thought was true for something which is more true and more factual. Let's see. Oh, and another thing with regard to the data discussion, one of the most, some of you may have heard of these Jupyter notebooks. I finally come to understand that this may turn out to be one of the most powerful tools available to science, because what it will enable a scientist to do is to share the data and the algorithms and everything else that led to a given conclusion. And so the ability to share not just the data, but all the other mechanisms in a package that you could exercise with suitable computing capability will allow repeatability in science. And that has been something which is a difficult challenge that has not been met very effectively. So with regulation has come up several times in the course of these discussions. I would like to again draw attention to the fact that the internet and the World Wide Web are layered structures. And the fact that they're layered means that there are different functions happening at different layers, and there are different parties executing those functions in the different layers. So if you want to have something to say about the way in which a particular layer is working, or the way in which a party, a participant, or an actor is behaving in a particular layer, you need to keep track of the fact that that's different depending on which layers you're in. The jurisdictions may be different depending on the layers that you're in. The incentives for changing behavior may be different depending on the layer you're in, which leads me to one final observation that's really important. Well, I have two, actually. One of them is that if you don't like the behavior that you're seeing, you have to understand the incentives that are driving that behavior. And then you have to ask yourself, is there any different incentive that would produce different behavior? And then, if there is an answer that yes, then you have to figure out, how do I change the incentives? And sometimes the law can help you. Think seatbelts, think about smoking, and the fact that you have this balance of scientific evidence and then legal incentives to say there are liabilities if you aren't wearing your seatbelt, or liabilities if you make cars without seatbelts, liabilities if you allow people to smoke where they shouldn't. So sometimes we need the legal structures to help us provide incentive, but because the internet is such a global phenomenon, we have to do this collaboratively across national boundaries. That's hard, but it's something that we really need to undertake. I love the term digital humanism, although it immediately made me think of a bunch of robots trying to understand people. And it's like the robots would get together and conspire to study digital humanism. The last point I would make has to do with a kind of an overarching perspective of this last 50 years or so. I think we started out with the hopes of a marketplace of ideas that would be broadly shared by the public, by academia, and by all the various stakeholders. So a marketplace of ideas, open and interactive. And what we've ended up with is a mob in the agora. So we have to do something about the mob, and that's the primary takeaway today, is figuring out how to get back to that marketplace of ideas that we were hoping for. Thank you.